Well, good morning, everyone. This is the sixth and final part of our series on critical race theory, also known as CRT. If you didn't get a handout there at the back of the sanctuary on the chairs there, so help yourselves. In reality, we could spend many more sessions on this very important topic, but unfortunately we can't, and I trust you will reach out to Pastor Matt or me if you are looking for additional resources to further your understanding on the history and elements of CRT. At the conclusion of the session last time, the question was asked, and I'm paraphrasing, so why all the big commotion about CRT? Why should Christians be concerned and knowledgeable about this topic? So to set the stage for today and to help answer that question, I want to share a roughly 3-minute video clip by Dr. Vodi Bakum, the author of the book Fault Lines, like this, which I highly recommend, and a person you can view on many YouTube videos at various interviews and conferences across the country. So with that, if our AV team...
critical race theory is part of a broader movement, the critical social justice movement. And the social justice movement has really been gaining traction in the last several years among Christians, among evangelicals, among Roman Catholics. It's been gaining traction. And part of the reason that it's gaining traction is because it sounds not only good, but it sounds familiar. Social justice movement. Who's not for justice, right? What Christian wouldn't be for justice? Racial injustice. Who wants racial injustice, right? We don't want any kind of racial injustice, least of all racial injustice. And so these ideas and these terminologies sound very familiar to Christians, and they've really gained a foothold. And one of the reasons that they've gained a foothold is that people don't know where they come from. They're not familiar with critical theory. They're not familiar with Marxist conflict theory. They're not familiar with, Antonio Gramsci's concept of hegemony and so on and so forth. They don't know that these are the things that lay beneath these concepts and ideologies. And so a lot of Christians, especially a lot of younger Christians who are, just coming out of the university or are in the university, have really been sort of inundated with these ideas and have sort of, infused them into their Christianity. And in their desire to be altruistic, they've been misguided. And it's caused a great deal of division within many churches and families and organizations and seminaries and so on and so forth. The Southern Baptist Convention, for example, just a couple of years ago, passed a resolution, the infamous Resolution 9 on critical race theory and intersectionality. And it's amazing that, the people who now know what critical race theory is and know what intersectionality is are scratching their heads trying to understand why the conservative Southern Baptist Convention would pass a resolution affirming critical race theory and affirming intersectionality. By the way, last year, the 6 presidents of the Southern Baptist seminaries came out with a statement against critical race theory. This is just a year after the convention passes a resolution in favor of critical race theory. So, these ideas have very much infiltrated the church and have caused a great deal of harm and continue to cause a great deal of harm as people, try to They try to say that this is an argument against people who are against racism and people who are not against racism, people who are fighting against injustice and people who are okay with injustice. And that's a red herring. They're building straw men. It's completely inaccurate. This is about an ideology that has its roots in Marxism versus an ideology that has its roots in the scripture.
Okay, for those of you who are with us in session 2, we looked at the aspects of scientific racism and its roots in the work of the father of taxonomy, Carolus Linnaeus. If the next slide, please. And for those who wonder why white-skinned people are even today referred to as Caucasians, we learned about Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. And we also learned about the father of the pseudoscience phrenology, Franz Joseph Gall, and finally the publication of Crania Americana in 1839 by Dr. Samuel Morton, and its implications for both slavery and westward expansion in America. We learned about the origins of the word race, and that it is a social construct and has no biological basis. The Human Genome Project confirmed that 3 billion base pairs of genetic letters in humans are 99.9% identical in every person. So we are indeed monogenetic. We are one race. Next slide. In session 4, we took an extended look at Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the nature of the dialectic, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, or the oppressor and the oppressed, and the key points of the Communist Manifesto. And in slide 6, we spent a bit of time with this graphic looking at the material base and ideological superstructure of a Marxist view of the world. So, slide 7, that brings us to our next person. Then we want to look at this and the origins of critical race theory, Antonio Gramsci, who you just heard Dr. Bauckham refer to. And you can see that he was born nearly a decade after the death of Karl Marx in 1883, and he lived a relatively short life, dying in 1937. Slide 8. So who is Antonio Gramsci? Well, he was from Sardinia, middle of 7 children, and he was hunchback from a malformed spine from birth or a childhood accident. There is some conjecture that a nursemaid may have been carrying him and dropped him, and that caused his deformity. But in any case, he suffered with that, obviously, all of his life. The next slide. And if you would reverse these, let's go to actually slide 10 first, and then we'll go back to 9. Thank you. He was continuously sickly. Until the age of 14, a coffin for him was kept at the ready in his bedroom. His father was imprisoned for a political cause, and his mother somehow kept all the children alive on the meager sum of being a seamstress. And he was a very bright boy. He left for Turin and the university, and it was there that he saw the factories of Fiat, and it was here that he found the class struggle of workers and bosses. So let's go back to slide 9. So he left the university and began writing. He founded a newspaper, L'Ordine Nuovo, the New Order, with its first issue delivered on May Day of 1919. And you can see the red arrows there, the socialist publication, and you can see the word there in Italian for proletariat. And he was a founder and leader of the Communist Party of Italy and a member of Parliament. So let's go on to slide 11. Because he was a member of Parliament, he was granted immunity for his viewpoints, but those immunities were suspended by Mussolini, and Gramsci was sent to prison. And later, in a prisoner exchange, it was proposed by the Vatican. It said, let's send Gramsci to Moscow in exchange for a group of priests imprisoned in the Soviet Union. What I think most telling is this next slide. We must prevent this brain from functioning for 20 years. And that was the prosecutor at his criminal trial, and that's quoted in prison notebooks, which we'll see in a minute about that. So the next slide. When he was in prison, he wrote his famous prison notebooks, describing the contents as everything that concerns people. It was over 2,800 written pages, and hopefully you can see in the background there, these were done in kind of rule books that were ultimately smuggled out of prison by his daughter-in-law. Next slide. They were completed by 1935, and they were only published in the years of 1948 to 51, and they weren't translated into English until the 1970s. But by 1957, nearly 400,000 copies had been sold. That's a lot of copies, and so we really need to know what people were interested in. Suffering from various heart, respiratory, and digestive diseases, he was transferred to a prison hospital, and on April the 25th, 1937, the same day that he received news that he would be released, he suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and died 2 days later. Next slide. So, what's the big idea that Gramsci had? Next slide. And the big idea is hegemony. Now, the root word for that is, in Greek, it merely means leader. So, as I've said time and time again, please, whenever you're in discussion with anyone, please ask them to define what their terms are. And we're going to get into the meaning of critical, we're going to get into the meaning of theory. And you may know what critical means in your definition, in your vocabulary, but to someone else it may mean something entirely different. So always be clear to ask what they mean. And this is why I think it's important for us to go through these roots, this background, to understand where this came from and the people that were involved. Now, in ancient Greece, hegemony denoted the politico-military dominance of one city-state over another city-state. And the dominant state is known as the hegemon. Pretty simple. Next slide. But he used this in a different way. Slide 17. Cultural hegemony is the idea that the dominant ideology of society, the beliefs, explanations, perceptions, values, and morals, reflects that of the ruling class, so the bourgeoisie. The dominant ideology justifies the social, political, and economic status quo as natural, inevitable, perpetual, and beneficial for everyone, rather than as an artificial social construct that benefits only the ruling class. So, why is that important? The next slide. Well, Gramsci was interested in why the Marxist revolution didn't sweep the West by the early 20th century. Why didn't that happen? It happened in the Soviet Union, but it didn't happen in Europe, it didn't happen in the United States. Why? And Gramsci suggested that capitalists did not maintain control simply coercively, as Marx would describe it, but also ideologically. The values of the bourgeoisie were the common values of all. These values helped to maintain the status quo and limited any possibility of revolution. So it's not the oppressor and the oppressed and the factories and so forth. There was something more, and that something more was what was going on in the minds, thoughts, beliefs of the people within that country. The next slide. So, what needs to happen? Well, the working class need to develop a culture of its own, separate and distinct from the common values of the larger society. Control their beliefs, and you control the people. Control their beliefs, and you control the people. That was only possible if the hegemony of the ruling class was in crisis. What also must the working class do? They must develop their own intellectuals with values that were critical of the status quo. Note that word critical. This would require the takeover of the educational establishment and institutions. These intellectuals, through the educational establishment and the state, had almost free rein to push forward the revolutionary idea. You'll see there that I put in, quote, control the robes. And you'll hear others speak about control the robes. What's that mean? The robes are those who are people in positions of authority. Your judges who wear robes. Back in the day, the university professors, what did they wear? They wore robes. You have government. Now, they don't wear robes, but they are people in positions of authority. So those are the things that you need to infiltrate, you need to get into, you need to change. And what comes next is the School of Critical Theory. We'll go to slide 20. So we have Gramsci, he dies, and then what happens? You have a group of people called the Institute for Social Research that was founded at the University of Frankfurt, and so thus became the named Frankfurt School of Critical Theorists. And the work of the Frankfurt School members, including Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Erich Fromm, Walter Benjamin, Jürgen Habermas, and Herbert Marcuse, is considered the heart of critical theory. And on the next slide, you'll see pictures of these men. And as you're looking at them, remember what I've warned you about repeatedly. Make certain you know the definition of the word and the reason for the word being used. Consider, for example, the term critical thinking skills. Now, I know that those of you who are educators, parents, students, you've heard this term over and over and over again. What are critical thinking skills? What does that mean? Well, that means probably to you, you pinpoint the issue, you collect information, you examine and scrutinize, you decide what's relevant, you self-evaluate, you draw conclusions, and then you explain your conclusions. That's what you do in critical thinking. But critical theory means something entirely different. The Critical Discourses Dictionary, and I want to take a moment there. When you get frustrated because you're saying, they're using this term, but I don't know what it means, you can go to a site called Critical Discourses, and it's published by James Lindsay, who's a PhD guy. He's an atheist, but he's very much involved in this, and he's done a yeoman's task in putting together a lot of information about this. But there he writes that the critical approach ultimately draws in the main from Karl Marx. Marx saw criticism of the system itself as the vital first step in remaking the world, saying, this is Marx, I am referring to ruthless criticism of all that exists. Ruthless both in the sense of not being afraid of the results it arrives at, and in the sense of being just a little afraid of conflict with the powers that be. So it's that whole aspect of tearing down to recreate in the image that you would have it. Therefore, criticism in the sense employed is destructive rather than constructive. It is more interested in finding ways in which the system is imperfect and making noise about them, reasonably or not, than it is any other identifiable activity, especially building something constructive. Now, the word theory. You may think you know what the word theory means, but you'll often see theory is capitalized with a capital T, making it a proper noun. And it is in reality a philosophy that adheres in various ways to three specific defining features. One, it proposes a moral vision for society. Two, it ruthlessly, following Marx, criticizes society and especially social systems and institutions for failing to live up to this vision. Third, it motivates activism on behalf of identifying, disrupting, dismantling, subverting, and deconstructing the system that produces those problems, which it also tends to see as ordinary and permanent, thus unfixable from within the system. This makes theory not just radical, but revolutionary, as a social revolution that remakes the system is the only way it deems it possible to create a society free of the current manifestations of systemic power. Now, I think this next slide will provide a quote that kind of drives this point home. This is Max Horkheimer of the Critical School, of the Frankfurt School. The revolution won't happen with guns. Rather, it will happen incrementally, year by year, generation by generation. We will gradually infiltrate their educational institutions and their political offices, transforming them slowly into Marxist entities as we move towards universal egalitarianism. So I think that's pretty specific what they thought their task was. Next slide. This is Theodor Adorno. What happens as the positive is essentially the negative. That is, the thing that is to be criticized. Now, lest you think that they didn't have some good ideas, I have a slide that's coming up which will show that, but Erich Fromm writes, man's main task in life is to give birth to himself, to become what he potentially is. The most important product of his effort is his own personality. If you want a definition of existentialism, that's that. Next slide. This is the one that I was thinking of. The other reason for our difficulty to discern the difference between the authentic and the sham lies in the hypnotic attraction of power and fame. If the name of a man or the title of a book is made famous by clever publicity, the average person is willing to believe the work's claims. So how many books may you have bought that have been well advertised, publicized, very specifically, forcefully? We're going to talk about some in a moment that have that designation. And if any of you have read White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, that book has been marketed. Her speaking fees are now upwards of $40,000. I think in 1 year alone she made $758,000 by her speaking fees. So you hear the book, everybody's reading it, I've got to read it. If that many people are reading it, it must be so. But please, don't let that grab you in. Get the book, read it, but most importantly, compare it to Scripture. And you may have some people say to you, well, the Bible may say that, but this person over here has said this, and you really need to understand this, and I think you'll change your mind. We need to use the Bible as the standard. Anything else is something which will compare that to the biblical standard. Now, I know we're trying to rush through what many, many books have been written about, but I want to try to track this through, and you see where we're going. We talked about Marx and Engels, and we talked about Antonio Gramsci, and then we talked about the critical school, which was started in Germany, and then it moved back to, at the World War II, it moved to the United States, to Columbia University and the teachers in college there. Then it ultimately went back to Germany. But, so I want you to track. You hear the word criticism, 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 criticism. Now we're going to come to the roots of critical race theory, which actually was in the law schools under critical legal studies. So the next slide, please. Before we get into Derek Bell, I want to read a couple of definitions for you, and I apologize for this, but I think you need to hear it because this is what the law schools themselves are saying. Cornell Law School states that although critical legal studies has been largely contained within the United States, it was influenced to a great extent by European philosophers such as Karl Marx, Max Weber, Max Horkheimer, Antonio Gramsci, and Michel Foucault, who's a Frenchman who we're not going to talk about. But critical legal studies is a theory which states that the law is necessarily intertwined with social issues, particularly stating that the law has inherent social biases. Proponents of critical legal studies believe that the law supports the interests of those who create the law. Sound like cultural hegemony? That's it. As such, critical legal studies states that the law supports a power dynamic which favors the historically privileged and disadvantages the historically underprivileged. CLS finds that the wealthy and the powerful use the law as an instrument for oppression in order to maintain their place in the hierarchy. Okay, so much for the neutrality of the law. Many in the CLS movement want to overturn the hierarchical structures of modern society, and they focus on the law as a tool in achieving this goal. So, a little bit about that. We're at slide 26. In 1971, Derrick Bell became the first black professor to receive tenure at Harvard Law School, but he left in protest in 1990, and he spent the last part of his career at NYU Law School. When he was actually called to Harvard and accepted the position, he said, I may be a pioneer, but I don't want to be the last one. I want to see many other faces similar to mine. And he was very unhappy with the number of other black lawyers who ended up not coming to Harvard. And one of his favorite theories is the principle of interest convergence, which he says is the interest of blacks in achieving racial equality will be accommodated only when it converges with the interests of whites. And that's what we just talked about, that the law is used by oppressors against the oppressed. And James Traub, who profiled Bell for the New Republic magazine in 1993, said, "This is a recipe for paralysis. If you convince whites that their racism is ineradicable, what are they supposed to do? And what are blacks to do with our hard-won victim status?" So, in the next slide, I'm going to take a look at where this term critical race theory comes from. And you're looking at Kimberly Crenshaw, who was the person who coined the term. And you really need to follow this closely. She says that, or the American Bar Association says, CRT is not a diversity and inclusion training, but a practice of interrogating the role of race and racism in society that emerged in the legal academy and spread to other fields of scholarship. Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term CRT, notes that CRT is not a noun, but a verb. It cannot be confined to a static and narrow definition, but is considered to be an evolving and malleable practice. It critiques how the social construction of race and institutionalized racism perpetuate a racial caste system that relegates people of color to the bottom tiers. CRT also recognizes that race intersects with other identities, including sexuality, gender identity, and others. CRT recognizes that racism is not a bygone relic of the past. Instead, it acknowledges that the legacy of slavery, segregation, and the imposition of second-class citizenship on Black Americans and other people of color continue to permeate the social fabric of this nation. So I think they're pretty clear in outlining where their position begins. But again, that it is malleable, it's always evolving. That's a very, very difficult thing to get your arms around, but we need to do that. Now, you hear the word intersectionality, and I must confess, you hear all these terms, cisgender, heteropatriarchy, the number of terms is nearly endless. But intersectionality only means that you may have multiple aspects that would be considered make you oppressed. And so it may be your color, your sexuality, whether you're male or female, whether you're transgender or not, whether you're poor or rich, whether you are disabled. The list goes on, and this intersectionality calculator, which I think may have been done tongue-in-cheek, but I found it on the internet, so it's got to be true, right? No, it's. I thought it was interesting that you take, and you can see that these are slides. You can slide the thing to one side or the other, and then it comes up with your intersectionality score. So the more things that you have in that realm make you more oppressed. And that's all that intersectionality means. And I think Kimberly Crenshaw herself uses the analogy of a car being struck in an intersection by other cars that have different aspects. And that's how it comes to be. So that's what intersectionality means. So out of all this, what has developed? And we're going to go through these because I think you should just have an awareness of them, where the terms come from, and some of the people that were involved. Because sometimes in conversation, somebody will use the word white privilege. Ask them the question, where did that term come from? Yeah. All people are equal. Yeah. Okay. All right. Slide 29. So this is Peggy McIntosh. She's an activist, scholar, and senior research scientist at the Wellesley Centers for Women. She's the founder of the National Seed Project, Seeking Educational Equity and Diversity. And she's the one that coined the term white privilege, and this is her book. And she uses another metaphor. I've come to see white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets. White privilege is like an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions, assurances, tools, maps, guides, code books, passports, visas, clothes, compass, emergency gear, and blank checks. So obviously, if you had a backpack that were filled with all those, that would enable you to do a lot of things. You need a visa to go to another country. You need a code book, perhaps, if you're asked to provide something to someone else. Obviously, your clothes, your compass to guide you, emergency gear, and blank checks. You need to have money to be able to do things you want to do. So that's what she sees as white privilege, and she comes to the realization that as a white woman, that she's had privileges that others have not had. Now, if you go to her website, you'll see that there are many, many lists written by her and others, but there's even one that I'll show you in the next slide. It's 30 examples of Christian privilege. So if you're interested in seeing what those are, I urge you to go and take a look at that. But it's quite informative, that's for sure. So one of the books that really has taken the country by storm is this next book, White Fragility. And Robin DiAngelo is the Affiliate Associate Professor of Education at the University of Washington in Seattle. She's also a tenured professor at Westfield State University in Massachusetts. In 2011, she coined the term white fragility in an academic article, and her book, White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, was released in June of 2018 and is currently being translated into 10 languages. And white fragility is a state in which even a minimal challenge to the white position becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive responses. The next slide. She advises that in her takes an anti-approach, she takes an anti-racist approach, which means that she holds these basic tenets. Racism is the foundation of Western society. We are socialized into a racial hierarchy. All of us are shaped by the forces of racism. No one is exempt. All white people benefit from the racial hierarchy, regardless of intentions. No one chose to be socialized into racism, so no one is bad. Racism must be continually identified, analyzed, and challenged. No one is ever done. The question is not if racism is at play, but how it is at play. And the racial hierarchy is invisible and taken for granted for most white people. Now, I've read way too much over the past year on all this stuff, but I think that this next quote, next slide, is this is Steve Q.J., a black writer, who said, "Robin DiAngelo's white fragility has single-handedly confused millions of people about race. It manages to talk down to black people and white people, and whilst offering nothing in the way of solutions. The most valuable contribution most people can make is to change their world, to stop treating black people as a field of study and start treating us like ordinary human beings." So what else has taken place? Next slide. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of the 1619 Project. It was written by Hannah Nicole Jones. It was published by the New York Times in 2019 to mark 400 years since the first enslaved Africans arrived on American shores. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 2019, and it reframes American history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of black Americans at the center of the U.S. narrative. The 1619 Project posits that the true founding date of the American Republic is not 1776 with the signing of the Declaration of Independence, but rather 1619, allegedly when the first African slaves were brought to American soil at the Jamestown colony. It goes further to posit that because of this historical incident, the United States has always been a nation founded economically and thus politically upon the institution of slavery, which was therefore encoded into the societal DNA of the American Republic. That is, the 1619 Project exists to go beyond the claim that racism is America's original sin, to make the far more extraordinary claim that it is, in fact, its genuine foundational principle. The next slide, please. This is Boston University professor and author Ibram Kendi, who wrote New York Times bestseller, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I quote what I think is one of the most difficult lines to comprehend. The only remedy to race discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. So in order to end discrimination, we have to undertake discrimination. And you know, it's like that pendulum. This happened to us, and so it comes back, and this must happen to you. I think Bill Maher even gets it when he talks in this next slide. He called it progressophobia. He defines it as a brain disorder that strikes liberals and makes them incapable of recognizing progress. It's like situational blindness, only what you can't see is that your dorm in 2021 is better than the South before the Civil War, which was one of the claims that was made by Derek Bell. So now, I want to go through this relatively quickly, but just to see how a concept or an idea can be taken and how people, you've heard what people have said explicitly. You saw the quote by Max Horkheimer as to what needed to be done. Make no mistake, people who want the hegemony to change to create their own hegemony will undertake a process. These are intelligent people, highly intelligent people, so they know what they're doing. So I was fascinated by an article by Dr. Albert Mohler, where he took a look at this next book, After the Ball, How America Will Conquer Its Fear and Hatred of Gays in the 90s. So this book was published in 1989. It was published by Marshall Kirk, a researcher in neuropsychiatry, and Hunter Madsen, a public relations consultant. And they argued that homosexuals must change their presentation to the heterosexual community if real success was to be made. Next slide. Gays must be portrayed, and this is from their book, gays must be portrayed as victims in need of protection so that straights will be inclined by reflex to adopt the role of protector, the oppressed and the oppressor. Conventional young people, middle-aged women, and older folks of all races need to be featured, not to mention the parents and straight friends of gays. To suggest in public that homosexuality might be chosen is to open the can of worms labeled moral choices and sin and give the religious intransigents a stick to beat us with. Straights must be taught that it is as natural for some persons to be homosexual as it is for others to be heterosexual. Wickedness and seduction have nothing to do with it. Next slide. They saw their book as a gay manifesto for the 1990s. That word sound familiar? As cynical as it may seem, AIDS gives us a chance, however, brief, to establish ourselves as a victimized minority, the oppressed, legitimately deserving of America's special protection and care. They called for homosexuals to talk incessantly about homosexuality in public, and the imagery of sex per se should be downplayed, and the issue of gay rights reduced as far as possible to an abstract social question. Next slide. Authors advise gays to use talk to muddy the moral waters, that is, to undercut the rationalizations that justify religious bigotry and to jam some of its psychic rewards. And how would they do that? This entails publicizing support by moderate churches and raising serious theological objections to conservative biblical teachings. It also means exposing the inconsistency and hatred underlying anti-gay doctrines. And authors suggested isolating conservative Christians by presenting them as hysterical backwoods preachers, drooling with hate to a degree that looks both comical and deranged. All right, we're going to move now into something that I know many of you have a great interest in, and that's Black Lives Matter. You see here a picture of the co-founders, April Tometi, Patrisse Cullors, and Alicia Garza. And from an interview that Patrisse had with Jared Ball on Real News Network, she says, and so Black Lives Matter originates from a need to intervene in a 500-year story and plan to kill and create havoc and chaos in Black people's lives. We believe that we are in a state of emergency, and that state of emergency looks like a crisis in the Black community at some of the highest levels. The first thing I think is that we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia, in particular, are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on, sort of, ideological theories. I don't know how you can be super versed, sort of, but anyway. And I think that we really need, what we really try to do is build a movement that could be utilized by many, many Black folk. The next slide. Cullors is a self-described queer polyamorous practitioner of Ifa, a religious tradition from Nigeria. And Dr. Melina Abdullah, chair of the Department of Pan-African Studies at Cal State University, Los Angeles, and co-founder of Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, opened an event explaining that while the movement is a social justice movement, it is first and foremost a spiritual movement. Next slide. She led the group in a ritual, the reciting of names of those taken by state violence before their time, ancestors now being called back to animate their own justice. George Floyd, Ashe. Philandro Castile, Ashe. Andrew Joseph, Ashe. Michael Brown, Ashe, and so on. As each name is recited, Dr. Abdullah poured libations on the ground as a group of over 100 chanted Ashe, a Yoruba term often used by practitioners of Ifa, a faith and divination system that originated in West Africa. So when you hear protesters pointing at someone and saying to them, pointing at them and saying, say the name, say the name, what they are doing or wanting to do is to call the spirit of that departed person back in the current event and say that we will rectify the wrong that was done to you. Next slide. And this is a further definition. It's West African Yoruba words have multiple meanings. Ashe is generally defined as the power to make things happen, or so let it be, and also refers to the spiritual life force that flows through things. Yoruban ancestors used chants to bring energy, shift energy, balance energy, and more. And this ritual, Dr. Abdullah explained, is a form of worship. And you can see in the photograph there that those things that are outlined, when that's drawn, that's the sphere of the center of worship. And so it all the symbols have a meaning and so forth. But I now want to move into what's taking place in some of the educational systems. And this to me is the most alarming aspect. In the next slide, you'll see something was done by a sociology professor, Barnard Hesse. This is the 8 white identities. And you'll see it goes from the left, the white supremacists, all the way around on the continuum to the white abolitionists. The next slide. A city public school principal asked parents to reflect on their whiteness. So he sent this out to all the parents in the school and said that they should reflect on their whiteness and identify themselves on this scale. And this is a curriculum that's written by Dr. Hesse, an associate professor of African American Studies at Northwestern University, who claims there is a regime of whiteness and there are action-oriented white identities. So how does he define a white supremacist? Clearly marked white society that preserves, names, and values white superiority. Moving halfway through, number 4, white benefit. They are sympathetic to a set of issues, but only privately. They won't speak or act in solidarity publicly because benefiting through whiteness in public, some people of color are in this category as well. And then on the right, white abolitionists, changing institutions, dismantling whiteness, and not allowing whiteness to reassert itself. And the next slide I've taken from a coloring book that's given to middle school students. You can see I took it from the DC Area Educators for Social Justice. And in it has a number of pages, but I just picked one. This is the queer affirming page, and you can't read the print on the right, and I don't know that you want to, but in any case, I just wanted you to see that materials like this are present within various school systems. How else is it affecting education? On the next slide, believe it or not, math can be racist. So 2 + 2 may or may not equal 4 is the cartoon that you'll see there. So what are indicators of white supremacy culture in the mathematics classroom? Focus on getting the right answer. Teaching math in a linear fashion. Requiring students to show their work. Grading students on demonstrated knowledge. The concept of mathematics being purely objective is unequivocally false, the manual explains. Upholding the idea that there are always right and wrong answers perpetuates objectivity. So you can tell me, for those of you, I don't know, Jim Adams is here, sending a rocket ship to the moon, how important it is to get your altitude and attitude and all that sort of thing correct. All right, next page, next slide. The framework explicitly rejects ideas of natural gifts and talents. So we must do away with gifted and talented programs. The framework rejects ability grouping, also called tracking, even though studies show that students do better when grouped with others who are progressing in their studies at the same pace. For some of you have students who may be really frustrated because they're in a classroom where others are seemingly getting the material faster than they are. They see them excelling and they're struggling. Some kids that motivates them. Other kids it really disappoints them and frustrates them. So putting them in where other students are going at the same pace as they is often the very best thing to do. Math, it says, is a tool to change the world. Under this pedagogy, students must develop a critical consciousness through which they challenge the status quo of the current social order. Now, what that has to do with mathematics is beyond me, but maybe you'll understand that. Teachers can take a justice-oriented perspective at any grade level, K through 12, the curriculum revisionists write. Students could be taught fractions in the distracting process of learning the math of organizing a protest march. So, lest you think that that only happens at the K through 12 level, this next slide. This is from Portland Community College. You can see it's a facilities plan, technical reports, critical race theory. They had their campus analyzed as to how critical race theory applied to all their facilities. And more than that, next slide, they wanted to renovate their Metropolitan Workforce Training Center. So they asked the architectural firm Bora to undergo training in critical race theory. And the architectural firm also went through design justice training, taught by Brian Lee of the nonprofit firm Colligate. And design justice, as Lee describes it, is the idea that race, culture, and architecture are inherently connected in a way that links art to racial equity and design to cultural space. I just took it from their website, folks. And a book that I've not read, but I've read reviews of it, and I thought this was pretty interesting. The next slide. The grocery store of today competes by offering us cultural meaning. Many of us construct identities from their options. We buy foods to demonstrate that we are health conscious or proud of our chocolatey indulgence, that we care for our families through price savings, or care for the earth through ecological stewardship. So Trader Joe's, catering to the overeducated and underpaid. Whole Foods, to the green-minded with green to spare. And Aldi, to the no-frills and budget-conscious crowd. But grocery industry has to focus on these three things: convenience, high quality, and low prices. And these three all are in tension. Serving often comes at the cost of delivering another. So imagine the shrimp that you eat is farm raised in Thailand, and they export thousands of pounds of shrimp. And then the big, mean people come and say, we got to have a better price. You got to compete. And though, where are the costs cut? And he would argue that it's cut through labor and so forth. So this whole mechanism is one that's very interesting. So we've got just a few more slides that we'll end with. Next slide. The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing, Archilochus. And Niebuhr wrote, there is no greater barrier to understanding than the assumption that the standpoint which we happen to occupy is a universal one. Pastor Matt talked about standpoint epistemology in one of his talks. Lance Morrow, in a fascinating article, suggests that Karl Marx was the supreme hedgehog. Everything for him was the conflict of economic classes. At the moment, the biggest one thing is race. The key, it seems, to all of America, to the innermost meanings of the country and its history. We talked about that today. It was said in the era of Joe McCarthy that he and his followers saw communists under every bed. The single-minded ideology of critical race theory sees racism in every white face, a racism systemic, pervasive, inescapable, damning. All white people are racists. And the next slide is a piece that I would commend to you. It gives a very good overview of all that I've talked about. And by the way, all my notes and annotations and so forth are available if you want to see them. I've tried to document everything. But this piece is by Neil Shenby and Pat Sawyer, Engaging Critical Theory and the Social Justice Movement. They write, the Bible tells one singular narrative about humankind and about redemption. It provides us with one singular standard of morality by which all values and norms in every culture will be judged. It offers us one true story about gender, one true story about sexuality, and one true story about religion. Moreover, it unashamedly declares that God has all the power in the universe, is completely sovereign over our lives, and answers to no one. To critical theorists, these totalizing, comprehensive, exclusive claims are unacceptable. From the perspective of contemporary critical theory, God is the ultimate oppressor, and we know that he is not that. They say that you can often tell the key aspects of things that you may be studying through cartoons that may be drawn. And I'd like to share some of those with you quickly, and we'll be done. I think this is probably my most favorite one. You can see the person squinting through the hole there. You can see the water tower has sprung a leak and the pipe serving it. But he looks in and says, it's raining, you lied to me. I can see it all from here. And then the person on the ladder sees it comprehensively, and that is truth. The next slide. If you've seen most of the pictures of Karl Marx, he has a beard like that. So you're out, he calls as the umpire. And the kid looks up and says, but he hasn't thrown a pitch yet. If you're white, you're racist. The next one. Sir, didn't Martin Luther King Jr. say that it all came down to simply equality, judging people by their character and not the color of their skin? And even Martin Luther King, the next slide, is being assaulted by critical race theory. And you can see that that is reflected there. What's it doing to our kids in the classroom? Next slide. I think critical race training is affecting his self-esteem. You think? And the next one is the quote by Martin Luther King, judge not by the content of his character, but by the color of his skin. Now, Schultz did not do these in the next one, but I like being black. That's nice. I like being white. Racist. And then the next one is a takeoff on Schultz. What if he had done this when he first introduced his black character? I'm very glad to know you. Hello, systemically racist, privileged white oppressor. Next slide. You said we were going to learn division today. We are. And lest you think that those teachers who have stood very forcefully and vocally, some even resigning their positions, to say that they will no longer teach in the public school system, this next slide, I think, reflects what's taking place. And I've read the war chest that the American Federation of Teachers have amassed to defend their programs of teaching critical race theory. And you see this kid says, "Are you going to take my milk money?" And he said, "No, we've got plenty of money. It's your mind we want." Next one. What exactly does critical race theory mean? It means I'm critical of the entire white race. So here again, the use of the word critical. Next one, getting kids to drink the Kool-Aid. Next one, seriously, you don't want all of this cleaned up? The 1619 Project, which we've discussed. Howard Zinn, those of you who are educators know who Howard Zinn is. He kind of rewrote the American history book. And of course, critical race theory. The 1776 Commission was set up by the previous president to kind of reinstitute or reinvigorate the teaching of American history. And for those of you who are looking at marriage, I hope this doesn't happen. And do you, Angela, agree to undergo a course of critical race theory? And then finally, in the cancel culture, Mickey's Muppet message misses the mark. And you've read about Dr. Seuss and others who are being canceled. And you'll even find now that there are researchers who are taking the text of all textbooks that have been written in the last 40 years. They're putting in keywords, key descriptions, and computing those, and then deciding by that algorithm what textbooks or what books need to be removed because there are not enough people of color in a book or whatever. And so there are some very interesting articles on that as well. So we've run a bit, 5 minutes over, and I apologize for that, but I do appreciate your attention. I know this is a whole lot to try to absorb in one sitting, but I just pray that this might be instructive to you. And remember, please, in your discussions with others, always be charitable, always be kind and gracious, but be sure that you ask people to have them explain what they're talking about to make sure that they truly know and are just not parroting something that they think is appropriate to say. So with that, let's close in a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, this is your house, this is your place. You have provided your word and your truth. And Lord, we just long to know you and your character, because in your character you have manifested yourself in the person of Jesus Christ. And we just thank you for this day and for Pastor's message today. I pray that you would go with each family here through the coming week. May you guide, guard, sustain them in every step. All these things we ask in the most precious name. Amen.